Sebastian Vettel only had to wait until his second race in red to take his first win as a Ferrari driver, and in the process, he inflicted Mercedes' first proper defeat of the hybrid era at the 2015 Malaysian Grand Prix. Vettel and Ferrari's triumph was well timed, as Mercedes' dominance in the season opener in Australia had set alarm bells ringing that its dominance was going to do serious damage to F1, although complaints from a struggling Red Bull team that had dominated the end of the V8 era fell on pretty deaf ears and were even mocked by world champion Lewis Hamilton. While all of that was going on at the front, McLaren and Honda were talking up how much progress they were making at the back of the field, as Fernando Alonso returned to F1 after missing Australia due to a concussion suffered in one of F1's most mysterious accidents in testing. Welcome to the second ever hybrid episode of Bring Back V10s with me, Glenn Freeman, and to help us revisit Malaysia 2015, I'm joined by two men who were there at Sepang that weekend, Ben Anderson and Ed Straw. Ben, hopefully this is a little easier than when you have to stretch your memory back 30 years or over a quarter of a century or whatever it is into the 90s. This is only 10 years ago and you were covering the race. So hopefully when I say when you think back to Malaysia 2015, what's the first thing that comes to mind? You've got plenty to choose from.
Well, yeah, you say this, but I could have sworn I had a memory of speaking to Adrian Sutil as the newly announced Williams reserve driver on this weekend, but it never happened. I can find no evidence of it. And when checked with Ed, he insisted that we did no interview with him, that he just stayed in the garage the whole weekend. So I think I've conflated 2 years into one.
Conflated 2 years into one. It was in our notes. It hasn't made the cut. I mean, there was plenty to choose from, and I couldn't get excited about Adrian Sutil becoming a Williams reserve driver because I don't remember it happening, and I feel that it had no influence on anything that followed. But we've talked about it now, so I'll have to show you the notes afterwards, and maybe there's a quote. Maybe there's a quote that we picked up that you actually got, and maybe you did speak to him. I'll send you the quote, and then you'll go, no, that definitely wasn't me.
Yeah, I mean, I remember he did nothing for Williams. It was one of the most pointlessly announced deals anyway. But my overriding memory of that weekend is standing trackside at FP1, trying not to burn horrendously in the gap in the ozone that exists over that circuit, watching Fernando Alonso, because there was this huge furore about the concussion you mentioned and his suitability to return to action this weekend. So there was massive interest in that first session. Could he actually drive a Formula One car again? And the answer, of course, was yes.
Yeah, could he drive a Formula One car without mysteriously steering it into a barrier?
Exactly, yeah.
Ed, what's your standout memory of this one? Did you talk to Adrian Sutil as well?
I do remember speaking to Adrian Sutil in the paddock and having a chat to him. But funnily enough, it took quite a while to access that memory because when this episode was first mentioned, I denied having been in Malaysia at all, because this was in a period when I was editing Autosport and I did about half the races over that period. But
you were there, I can confirm.
Yeah, well, you insisted I was there, and I have found audio evidence I was there and notes and the like. But bizarrely, I've got so few memories of actually being there on site. I obviously remember the race, but I'd remember that if I'd just seen it on TV. So I guess if you do 300 odd Grand Prix or just under, or however many I've done, there's some that just completely fade from your memory. But fortunately, there is written evidence that I was there. And
you spoke to James Allison, I'm sure, after Vettel's victory.
That's
I've got
very,
a memory
very
of
possible.
you going down to the Ferrari garage. They did an impromptu, Allison speaks, because it's a first win for his Ferrari, and I'm sure you went to that.
Well, there were some quotes from Alison. Again, I have no recollection of doing that, but I do remember, and I remember this by virtue of reading my editorial in Autosport magazine, that this was a great bolt from the blue and a big shot in the arm for Grand Prix racing after the boringness of Australia. So evidently, I remember that very, very well. But it's quite a funny case actually of just going through. I guess some races you remember more than others, and you remember loads of things going on, but I've got so little recollection. I've got a vague notion I might have been with you trackside for FP1. Did we watch in the high-speed S's in the middle?
No, you didn't come out with me. It was
brilliant.
That was the previous year. We watched the Williamses going through that high-speed section, and you were commenting about how terrible they were. So you've done what I did with Sutton and conflated 2 years into one.
Excellent. So my credentials are really well established for this, in that I don't really remember anything that actually happened. But fortunately, I did have copious notes and audio material and all that kind of thing. So I've been able to jog my memory. So I can thank past Ed for the work that he did there, even if I've not retained it in my brain.
We're off to a good start then. I thought, we'll
Brilliant.
pick you two because it's great. You were both there. This will go really well. And now it's like, I'm not really sure I was there, and I can't remember speaking to Adrian Sutil. So maybe we'll wipe the last 2 minutes of the podcast so everybody feels that you're speaking with a bit more conviction. I will say that when I looked back at some of the stories that ran on Autosport's website over the weekend, my name's on a lot of them as well. So that means I must have been doing a shift from base, which I also have no recollection of. But the reason we have chosen this race is because, it was a really interesting flip of the script, really. And Vettel's first win, Vettel and Ferrari is a memorable partnership, one that didn't have perhaps the success we all thought it might in the end. But this was a big moment for F1. And let's kick off with one of the topics that I mentioned in the intro and Ben mentioned as well. Fernando Alonso returned to the F1 paddock after one of the most mysterious absences there's ever been. Alonso had missed the season opener in Australia while recovering from his strange crash in testing, where his car had veered into the wall, exiting Barcelona's fast turn 3, and he suffered a concussion. If you weren't following F1 in 2015 and you're wondering why this is so mysterious, it's because there was never a clear explanation given for what caused the crash, and McLaren hadn't helped matters early on with some mixed messaging around if Alonso was injured or not. But we'll focus purely on his return to the paddock. Frankly, I think I know I say this a lot, we could do a whole episode from test crash to this moment, but we're just going to focus on he's back in the paddock. Ed and Ben might even remember seeing him there. Before the weekend, he gave his theory on what caused the crash. He felt it was caused by a steering problem, saying even though he lost consciousness in the helicopter on the way to the hospital, he remembered everything about the accident. He said the steering had locked in turn 3, sending him into the inside wall, but he'd managed to brake and downshift from 5th gear to 3rd before the impact. However, he said there was not a clear answer in the data McLaren had about the crash, and he suggested McLaren's data acquisition in that area of the car was not at the top during testing, but they'd added more sensors to the car since then. Ben, what was it like trying to get to the bottom of this bizarre story? We've got the excitement of, yay, Fernando's back, but we've also got this still, what the hell actually happened going on in the background?
I don't think anyone really knows. It was the most difficult story to chase because the team was contradicting the driver was contradicting the team was contradicting itself. You had the medical sensitivity over it because Alonso was concussed. The fuzzy memory he had because he tried to deny that he'd had that retrograde amnesia that you can get when you have concussions, and that he felt that he'd woken up or regained consciousness and thought he was a 9-year-old karting version of Fernando Alonso rather than the one consigned to the McLaren Honda misery, and all that stuff came back. But yet he remembered bits about the accident that tallied, and then there were conflicting reports about like the team blaming wind, and then Alonso saying, "Oh yeah, but even a hurricane couldn't have blown me off track at that speed." But he was going faster than at any point in testing so far. So it was a complete mess, and it wasn't helped by there being no onboard footage. There was CCTV, I believe, but it was never released. And you had Ron Dennis wading in as well, which is fun, but it didn't help.
Though, did it?
Did not help give us clarity. And filling the gaps, in fairness, okay, it was a weird situation. McLaren created a lot of the gaps in the knowledge, and those were filled with conspiracy theories about Alonso having some kind of medical event in the car before he crashed, that he was electrocuted by the car, and that's why he crashed. And Ron, I remember famously in the pre-season test when he came in to deliver his press conference about Fernando, the situation, and that Kevin Magnussen would drive probably if Fernando wasn't fit. I can categorically rule out electrification, which is stuck in my mind more than actually being at the 2015 Malaysian Grand Prix. And Dennis also tried to claim that Alonso hadn't had a concussion, that he displayed concussion symptoms, but there was nothing medically wrong with him, and that just wasn't true. So you had complete mess. Dennis saying one thing, Eric Boulier, who was racing director, saying no, there was a concussion. The team saying there was nothing wrong with the car. Alonso saying there was something wrong with the steering. So basically, nobody knew what was going on.
It was one of those things where I always remember how rampant the conspiracy theories were. I remember being at the Australian Grand Prix. I do remember being there the race before and wandering down Fitzroy Street, which is kind of adjacent to the track in St Kilda. And I ran into one well-known journalist, who I won't name, who said, "Oh no, he's never going to race in Formula One again. You know, this was really serious. There was some electrification, etc." It wasn't Ron Dennis, even though that word may have been used.
Categorically ruled out.
Yeah, but that was the extent to which it was going on. Everyone was running around saying, "Oh, it's this, it's this, it's this." I think when you boil down to it, there was unquestionably a concussion. I think, as is often the case, there's a lot of failure to understand what a concussion is and how serious it is. People sometimes conflate it with unconsciousness, and it's slightly different to that. They come up with all sorts of reasons why, we missed a race, therefore it must have been more serious. Well, a concussion is pretty serious. A secondary concussion can be enormously serious. So there was that, all of what McLaren were doing, all of these theories, etc., etc. It's so rare, actually, for something like this to happen, because even at testing these days, there's so much coverage and stuff going on that this was quite an old school kind of thing, wasn't it, in terms of the conspiracy theories and what was going on. I think we can be sure there was a concussion. Alonso may have played down the seriousness. I did, to remind myself, watch the video of the press conference on Thursday, which he was in, just to remind myself, and there were lots of questions there. So maybe he downplayed it a little bit because he didn't want any question marks over his fitness, and McLaren obviously were doing what they were doing. So it was, I think, there at its heart, there was a bit of a failure in terms of the communications at McLaren, particularly from what Ron Dennis said, that just made it look a lot more than it actually was. Because sometimes a car hits a wall and a driver gets concussed. It does happen. Although I think we'll never quite understand exactly what that phenomenon Alonso was talking about with the steering not working. And it's not impossible that he momentarily blacked out, because my understanding of when there have been cases of drivers blacking out, they do kind of have that feeling, especially if it's a brief blackout. But why he would have done that makes no sense. So yeah, it's very, very hard to, still to this day, to be absolutely certain of what's gone on. But let's say if you apply Occam's razor to it, you can simplify quite a bit all the stuff that was going on.
Yeah, the main feeling from people kind of outside McLaren engineers that looked at it, there was some GPS data, is that basically Alonso lost it. He went a bit quicker through turn 3 than he'd been before. He got wide over the curb onto the AstroTurf, lost the car. This whole theory that he maybe blacked out before he hit the wall or had some problem doesn't really tally with the fact he managed to brake and downshift. That bit of his memory seems to tally with the data. It seems like there must have been something weird that happened to the car that he went off in the way that he did. And I think the best theory, and Ron Dennis did kind of support this at the time, is that he hit the wall at a kind of side-on angle. And of course, all the kind of safety devices, hands and etc., were developed for head-on impacts and to try to mitigate problems in that scenario. And Alonso, I think, went almost flush into the wall and effectively had like a sideways whiplash of the head. And that's the best working theory in terms of how the concussion was caused. But as Ed said, everything was just so hazy because it was an old school test. There wasn't the live coverage you have now. TV cameras were basically not there. They were in the pit lane if they were there at all. And you just had not really any eyewitnesses of the one main eyewitness having a fuzzy memory because he basically had a concussion, and they were protecting him, I think, by making him miss races and whatnot. It seemed to be at the upper end of kind of seriousness, and they were playing it safe by saying, look, you know, if you come back too soon, and as Ed says, if you have a secondary concussion, you could be in big trouble. So within all this kind of mystery and Alonso not remembering and McLaren not wanting to say anything, we just had the most nonsense things filling the gap. And as a journalist, you had to work through all of that because you had other members of the media cohort saying, oh, the drivers don't want to race with him, he's going to be unsafe, he can't have his license back. And this was going on right up even until the Thursday before the cars were due to hit the track in Malaysia. So there was still always this sense of like, what actually is going to happen? What is Alonso going to be like? And of course, when he actually hit the track, it was, oh, he's absolutely fine. And then everything was forgotten.
If you're to look at it, most likely it was a normal crash. The one thing that you start to ask about is that claim from Alonso that it's a steering problem. It's not impossible because they're having all sorts of problems at that time, McLaren, that there was maybe some resistance because the hydraulics had some interruption or just something just temporarily happened that may not have shown up in the data that made him feel like it had completely locked. Maybe it was just more resistance or something. So I think it was just one of those normal things. But yeah, the fact there was so much going around, I think this has kind of become fact now forever. It remains a bit of a mystery. And as is quite often the case with mysteries, normally the boring, predictable answer that it was just man puts a Formula One car into a wall, which sometimes does happen, and the wall's quite hard. Yes, exactly. That happens. So, I'm sure you will continue to see speculation about this forever. But all you can do as a journalist is go with what evidence you've got. I think we can rule out any kind of electrical problem, electrocution or that kind of thing related to this. There seems to be zero evidence for that. Could have been interruption in the steering or something that while he was trying to correct. But yeah, it was just one of those things. And it's a good lesson in why it's important for teams to be accurate and precise with what they're talking about in terms of the sorts of injuries that happen, because otherwise you get all this nonsense.
I'm glad you said electrocution there, because I was going to say earlier, Ron Dennis meant electrocution, didn't he? Not electrification.
I think so.
He wasn't predicting the next 10 years of the automotive industry, was it?
No, it was a Ronism, which essentially referred to the idea that Alonso had suffered an electric shock. And that's why it stood out in my memory, because even in that situation, Ron was able to invent some language that was kind of appropriate, but just was completely made up.
Yeah, didn't help. I remember you talked about all the speculation in the paddock and all that. I knew someone at the time who worked on the shop floor at McLaren, I think, and I remember them saying that this speculation was rampant in the rank and file at the team as well, back in Woking. And I remember the theory he told me. I've never put this out there before, but it's 10 years ago. I'm sure people don't care now. He said that the main rumour he heard in McLaren was that Alonso's seatbelts failed in some way. And he was never sure if that was before the accident or during, or if that was what led to like the strange head impact or anything like that. But again, like these wild theories weren't just people on the outside looking in. There were lots of regular people in McLaren who didn't know either.
Yeah, that was one of the theories. I remember that surfacing even at the time.
Maybe you heard it from me.
It's good that you remember. Maybe, yeah. I mean, we've already established how hazy our own memories are of this whole
Speak
period.
for yourself.
But yeah, that was one of the theories. But again, because the team was so guarded about, they didn't reveal any of data they did have in terms of what happened in the crash. They were contradicting themselves, like I say. What I don't really understand, I think probably what would happen now, especially with coverage being so much greater, is why they didn't just sit down and do a proper debrief, like get Alonso, elements of the team, and just explain it as best they could all together, get on the same page, and then just move on from it. But they sort of seemed to try to do blanket no coverage when the accident happened, and then kind of drip feed bits out as the conspiracy theories established, because of course a lot of publishing was not very rigorous, and people would just put their theories out there and commit them to web. So you'd have McLaren basically becoming reactive and seeing all these crazy things pop up, whether it was, some internal rumours like seatbelts, or whether it was this kind of electrification that Ron referred to. And they were having to kind of whack-a-mole it and jump on each thing and say, oh no, that didn't happen, this happened. And I think they could have controlled the message, as Ed put it, a lot better if they'd just gone, right, okay, we know Alonso's fine now. We're going to sit down at this point, and we're going to have, if Ron wants to be there, he can. We're going to have Ron, Eric Boullier and Fernando, and we're just going to explain as best we can, and also explain the limitations in why we can't explain it more fully.
McLaren and Alonso continued to not be quite on the same page once practice started. So Ben's seen Alonso from trackside and he goes, oh yeah, he's fine. He hasn't driven off the track again.
No.
But McLaren racing director Eric Boullier, who we've already mentioned, declared Alonso was at 100% from the first moment and that he was exactly as he was before. Alonso disagreed with that, saying that he felt great in the car and enjoyed being back, but he added, I am not 100% physically fit after 2 weeks not in the car. After gym, simulator, whatever you do, it's never the same as when you drive the car. Ed, we've outlined our view that McLaren kind of made a mess of trying to deal with this. Were they just trying too hard by this point, once Fernando's back? Are they just trying too hard to take every opportunity to go, no, everything's fine, everything's back to normal, everybody move on? It felt like they couldn't resist digging themselves into holes.
Yeah, it comes out to that communication point, doesn't it? if they're constantly saying everything's fine, everything's perfect, everything's brilliant, people start to say, wait a minute, why are they saying that? If I start saying this podcast's going really well, everything's been absolutely perfect, no problems at all, really good,
no.
yeah, perfect, bring back V10s. Everyone listening is going to say, wait a minute. So I think
there's no V10s.
Exactly, and
it's
even
not
that
a perfect episode at all.
That's true, yeah. Even that evidence, that thing you cited about Alonso saying he wasn't 100% fit, wasn't 100% fit, and Bouillet saying he was. They're kind of saying very fractionally different things, because Bouillet's saying, he's recovered from everything, he's normal. Alonso's just saying, well, my fitness regime's just had a little bit of a knock to it, so I'm not quite at 100% normal peak conditioning, if you like. So even then, there's just that little bit of a disconnect. And I presume some of it stems from the fact McLaren wanted to scotch the idea anything may have gone wrong with the car, and Alonso was convinced that it had. So there was that disconnect that I think also lay at the heart of it, in that Alonso wanted to say, something did go wrong. The team wanted to say, it was the driver's, basically by implication, the driver's mistake or a gust of wind or whatever. So, it was just an ongoing mess. And every time anyone said anything, it caused some other contradiction to come up. So it's, just a brilliant example of just saying things, stoking the fire, no matter what you say.
I suspect Alonso revelled in it a bit too, because he loves a wind-up, and McLaren were giving him basically an open goal by not even getting their own messaging straight, so he could just fit into these gaps and say, well, I think this happened actually. And there was no real way for them to contradict him properly, because they'd already lost all their credibility by not getting their own story straight.
I think it's just a good example of Ron Dennis perhaps ideally not getting involved in that sort of thing, because all that concussion symptoms but not concussion, and it all comes back to that not understanding what concussion is, and it is serious. And I think even if they were conservative keeping him out of the car in Australia, it made a lot of sense, because the car failed before the race even started in Australia, so that wasn't great use for standing Kevin Magnussen. But you don't take chances with this sort of thing. It's better to be safe than sorry, especially when there's nothing really to play for.
I think that's another reason why Alonso made the comment he did about physical fitness, because if you remember, the testing was absolutely awful. They did hardly any laps. Then he missed a race. So he just wouldn't have had the in-car fitness, never mind the training fitness that was interrupted by his recovery.
And like Ed said, they're probably saying slightly different things. Bouillet probably meant he's fine, like there's no obvious ill effects. But that comes across as, it's just the wording you use then allows somebody to ask Fernando, are you 100%? And he can go, well, in terms of this way, no, I'm not. And then we've got the two contrasting views, when actually they might roughly mean the same thing. I do also wonder, I think, as you said there, Ed, I wonder how much of the tailspin McLaren got into over this was actually down to perhaps the damage done by Ron's attempts to control the message himself in the immediate aftermath. I think in testing, I'm sure Ron was at that test trying.
It was in Barcelona. They went to I think there was one more day, and he came to the final day and did a kind of big sit down to get on top of everything.
Well, that's it.
Just created more mess.
Yeah, he probably thought, I'll go there, I'll hold court for 20 minutes, and that will simmer everything down. And kind of the world and media coverage have moved on by that point, and actually everything you say gets picked apart rather than just parroted. And that's what caused them all the problems, and then they just couldn't get back on top of it after that. So we've mentioned already that McLaren were quite good at digging themselves into holes during this period, and they did that again, I feel, after the first day of practice, talking up the incredible rate of progress since their disastrous pre-season and forgettable first race of the new Honda era in Australia. Alonso called the first day in Malaysia a big step forward, saying the team had gained 1.5 seconds in 2 weeks, and he was pleased to get through 45 laps of running without any problems, as in testing he'd never been able to do more than 4 or 5 laps before having to stop. Teammate Jenson Button joined in, saying that McLaren's progress might not have looked as impressive from the outside because we are so far behind that you won't see a position change, but he said McLaren had found a good chunk in terms of performance. Button said it was not only coming from more engine power, but also better cooling and aero updates, all of which was gaining lap time for McLaren. Ed, we'll come back to McLaren at the end of this weekend as well, but at this stage, was it a fair point that because things had started so badly, McLaren was making actually quite a big amount of progress in this early part of 2015, just from one race to the next.
Well, yeah, they were making progress, but it was just from such a low starting point. They were so far behind with the whole thing, on the Honda side and the problems they were having, that it just meant it was a kind of complete mess, really. And you're at the point where a big improvement is being able to run uninterrupted for something approaching a normal length of time. So, yeah, I mean, they were playing catch-up, but they were playing catch-up the whole season. So, yeah, it's like percentage growth, isn't it? You can look at percentage growth numbers and they look great, but if the base number is really, really low, it's like, well, that's not quite as impressive as a lower growth number for a higher thing in terms of actual gains. So, yeah, fine, but yeah, you've got a very, very long way to go.
They were basically moving from completely embarrassing to slightly less embarrassing at this point. And I think getting a bit overexcited by it. I remember doing an interview with Arai-san, who at that point was running the Honda F1 engine program. At the final test of 2014, they debuted the new Honda engine and they were quite excited about it. And it couldn't run. It just didn't work. And he was explaining that they felt really confident about the hybrid side, that they would be able to really crack that, and they just couldn't do it. And I think you were at the first test of 2015 with us, Glenn, in Jerez, and they were seconds off. Like, not only could they not do many laps, like you say, maybe 4 or so in a row by that point, they were like 6 or more seconds off the pace. It was absolutely woeful. And the only reason I think they got away with it to some extent early in the season is because there was one team on the grid that was even more embarrassing.
Yeah, we'll talk about them later.
Manor, who couldn't even run their cars at all and get them out the garage, never mind do laps. So, yeah, I mean, for what McLaren set out to do at this point, it was absolutely awful. I think they were just clinging to hope at this point and just trying to paint as positive a picture as they could.
And remember, Honda was still saying quite close to the end of the 2014 season, they expected to come in and be challenging Mercedes, basically in terms of the engine quality. I remember Arai-san saying, I think it's Suzuka in a press conference, which would have been the previous October. Yeah, that's still our objective. And they were miles off it. So it tells you about how everyone was underestimating. And it wasn't just Honda, as future events will to this will show. McLaren wasn't perfect in the way it was doing things either. So yeah, and it just made them be in a massive hole, and just all they wanted to do is just say, well, look, we are actually making progress, just to show that they were, but it wasn't progress that was going to lead anywhere.
And this partnership had been talked up from the moment it was announced. When was it announced? Was it 2013 sometime? From the
Goodwood, wasn't it?
The moment they came together, all the talk was, this is going to be McLaren Honda, the Senna Prost era part 2. We're gonna dominate, and it, so expectations were through the roof, and then you're not just under delivering, you're not even in the same stratosphere as the expectations you've set.
Yeah, it was announced a bit before Goodwood, the actual press conference in Tokyo. I know that because I followed the press conference remotely, and I interviewed Arai-san at Goodwood, so that must have been after. So it's at some point.
That's what I remember
in 2013.
Honda's sluggish start then to its F1 return raised questions about if it would have benefited from supplying more than one team, so it had more data to work with. But Honda's F1 boss, Yasuhisa Arai, who we've just mentioned, believed staying focused on McLaren would be enough. He said Honda had enough data to develop in a good direction, and if we supplied another team to get more data, that data would make no difference to us, as a team of McLaren's calibre with 2 world champion drivers gave Honda all the feedback it needed. He described the troubleshooting of the early months of 2015 as like a pop-up game in the arcade. This is going to be our second mention. I assume he means whack-a-mole, which you've already heard once in this episode. And he said a lot of the problems Honda encountered were unexpected. However, when asked if that originally stated target of winning a race in 2015 was going to be revised, Arai said, "We don't change our targets. Winning this year is the aim." Ben, I'm not going to ask you to pass comment on that target nonsense, but do you think I remember you followed the McLaren Honda saga very closely in your years as an F1 full-time correspondent. At the beginning, do you think Honda would have benefited from having another team alongside McLaren?
At the time, I kind of bought this argument that they just needed to focus on what they were doing. But I think in retrospect, it would have helped. And the main reason is, although they would have been stretched, it felt like at the time they were overstretched. They underestimated the challenge. They needed just to focus on doing the basics rather than, doing 4 engines instead of 2. But the way Sam was talking in that bit, that excerpt you mentioned, it just feels like Ron Dennis is hanging over his shoulder. This was all kind of driven by Ron. Ron wanted the works engine deal. Ron didn't want to be with Mercedes anymore. Ron made 2014 more difficult for McLaren by pre-announcing his Honda deal and then basically saying, we're not going to stay with you anymore. Ron wanted it to be a return to the absolute domination, which I think is the phrase he used before the season started with Honda that everyone remembered from 1988. Ron wanted the size 0 packaging on the McLaren car that was supposed to give them this massive aero advantage, and that really boxed Honda into a corner. Like most of their not all of their problems, but a big chunk of their problems were didn't have any physical room to do stuff to the engine. And eventually they got to the point where they started to push back against that. But at this point, they're very much trying to protect their partnership with McLaren and stay on the same page as them. And I feel like if they'd had the second team from the start and been able to do that or force that through, that team wouldn't have had the same size 0 packaging just for one. And they would have been able to see how their engine performed in a different layout. And that might just have led McLaren to see through their own hubris a bit earlier than they did. But it was never going to happen because at this point Red Bull are falling out with Renault quite badly, which I'm sure we'll get onto. And there was even talk at one stage of them looking for a Honda engine, and Ron had an exclusivity clause. He definitely didn't want Red Bull to be part of that family, but I don't think he wanted anyone. He wanted it all for himself, so it was never a consideration. And I felt really throughout this whole period, what Honda wanted or needed was never really at the top of McLaren's priority list.
Yeah, Ron wanted to recreate the glory days of the first partnership, but I remember someone at the time telling me he turned down a proposal for a red and white livery. Because obviously at the start of the season, they kept the silver, didn't they? And I remember Ed was particularly wound up about that, going, why is this car still silver? It's not got the Mercedes thing anymore. But they soon changed that. But they went for black instead of white. Anyway, let's move on from McLaren. We spent a long time talking about them, and we're going to talk about them again at the end. Alonso wasn't the only driver returning to action in Malaysia, as Williams driver Valtteri Bottas had been a last-minute withdrawal from the Australian Grand Prix due to severe back pain. Bottas said Williams had aimed to prevent a repeat of this by changing his seat and pedal position to put less pressure on his back. He said the aim was to put his back in a more neutral position in the car so that when there was a compression, it goes to all of the discs in his spine with similar pressure. He said he was still in pain in Malaysia, but it was a consistent pain that wasn't going to get any worse, and his doctors had told him there was no safety risk to him getting back in the car as long as he could live with the pain. And he said he could handle the pain because he hadn't yet maxed out on the painkillers he was allowed to take. Ed, are you surprised things like this don't happen more often, given how tightly packaged into the car drivers are? And let's face it, the designers, it's not really top of their list to think about driver comfort.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a really weird seating position generally for the drivers. It's quite easy to forget that actually when they're in the cars. But if you ever see kind of a cutaway style illustration or something, you see the strange angles they're at, and they're very tightly in there as well. They're held really, really securely. So it is pretty easy, I would have thought, to get kind of a load path, for want of a better word, that is uneven in terms of how it distributes. So it is surprising, but I guess it tells you how much effort goes into making sure that doesn't happen and getting the seats exactly right, and that's why you see drivers sometimes modifying their own seats, like just sort of sanding away a few bits, because if there's a little bit of pressure just in the wrong place, that can change that load distribution. So it does surprise me that it doesn't happen a little bit more, given how rigid everything is in the forces, particularly these days with the ground effect cars. But I guess it's also testament to how much effort goes into really getting those seat positions absolutely bang on the money. And I imagine as time's gone on, the underlying science has been understood better about how to package somebody in the car proper, and obviously each driver will know their own particular challenges, because if you're dealing with someone like Valtteri Bottas, it's very different geometrically to Esteban Ocon, just to take an extreme example from today.
Yeah, I think also the seat technology itself has evolved quite a lot from even 10 years ago to now. So, they have much cleverer memory foams and stuff that's much better for cushioning. And you tend to see much fewer, hear much fewer stories about back injuries caused just from, wear and tear rather than, shunt. So there was a bit at the start of the ground effect here in terms of the bouncing, but that was obviously quite an unusual effect. In this period, there were a few more kind of just standard weird seat things, but also particularly at Williams, who I imagine were probably behind the times and a bit old school in how they did seats anyway, because they did a lot of things in quite an old school way at this point in their history. And Bottas himself had more than one problem with his seats. I remember, I think it was maybe later in this season, he had problems with his belts as well, and he had to come in during a race to have his belts, I think, done up again. So going back to what you said in the earlier segment about McLaren Honda and Alonso's accident, Glenn, maybe the seatbelt thing isn't totally far-fetched, because there were teams who actually did have seatbelt problems in this period. So it's not so far-fetched in terms of the conspiracy theories that Alonso might have done too.
Another big talking point about Williams was if the team would be able to keep pace in the development war after its brilliant 2014 season, where it finished third in the constructors' standings behind only Mercedes and Red Bull. Seems unthinkable now. There was an assumption from many people that once other teams caught up and the Mercedes engine advantage that had been so big in 2014 started to reduce, Williams would fall back. And Bottas suggested in Malaysia that Williams had a lot of work to do because others made huge steps. Williams' head of vehicle performance, Rob Smedley, was certain that Williams could keep up in the development war, saying he'd seen a huge change in mentality over his first 12 months at the team, adding it now believes it can outdevelop any other team. He said the Aero team were doing a fantastic job in the wind tunnel with the amount of performance they were bringing, and he said the mechanical design team were doing an immense job. He believed Williams was starting 2015 with a solid car and it could now push on, adding, "I have no doubt we can outdevelop other people." Ben, I feel a bit bad asking this question, particularly as Rob has revealed on another podcast in the past that he listens to Bring Back V10s. And if that's still the case, Rob, then I apologise in advance for this question. Ben, do you think history proved that Williams wasn't ready to keep pace in the development war?
I think ultimately it did. At this point, the optimism is justified because they came off a really strong 2014 season. They did develop well. I think
they didn't trail off in 2014, did they? It wasn't
no.
like they banked all their points at the start of the year and then got caught up.
No, I mean they did start well, but yeah, they finished the season with arguably the second fastest car, and that was against the Red Bull-Renault, which wasn't a bad car itself. Obviously, a lot of that was to do with the engine, and I think they did benefit throughout this particular phase of Formula One from being pretty much the favoured Mercedes customer. And of course, this was before rules were introduced to mandate that customer specs were the same as work specs. So you could get, in theory, 2, 3 or 4 different phases of engine mapping, depending on what the manufacturer wanted to do. And I think I've told a story before on maybe the only other Bring Back MGUH episode of this podcast, where there is a story of one team getting the wrong software mapping for a practice session, and then the engine engineer coming in and going, "Oh no, this is your one," and plugging in a different one. And I imagine if any team was getting a decent rub of it from Mercedes, who had obviously a massive advantage at this point, it would have been Williams. And their basic car profile was quite similar to what we've known even until recently, quite low downforce, not brilliant in the slow corners, but a rocket ship on the straights and in the fast stuff. And I think that, allied to the extra power that Mercedes was giving them, made them really potent. They were also quite good on things like crash testing at this point. So if you remember at the start of 14, the nose rules changed quite substantially. We had all those proboscis noses as teams were kind of struggling to work out how to fit the mandated FIA safety criteria without completely ruining their cars. Williams were quite at the forefront of mitigating that challenge, and that carried them through 14 and into 15. But then as everything became more about the fine detail, I think they just ran aground, and Smedley and Pat Symonds were really good at kind of bringing some insight from more sophisticated teams and getting them to snatch the low-hanging fruit. But as it became about the fine detail and more investment, they got quite frustrated, and some of the front wing work later in this rule set didn't really pay off for Williams, and that frustrated Pat Symonds quite a lot. Teams were starting to look at fuel partners. I remember Williams did a deal with Petrobras, and that was meant to be a big thing that carried them off on their own direction. Nothing came of it. Plus, other teams were underperforming. Red Bull, particularly in 15, they got their act together later. Ferrari, who are rubbish in 2014, got their act together this season. Force India, they were quite behind the curve and struggling to pay their bills, but they introduced a B-spec car later this season. That started to bring them into the fight. So there was all these different elements that kind of favoured Williams at the start, but just relentlessly kind of ground them down. But in retrospect, this was one of their most competitive recent periods. They just weren't built to last, I'm afraid.
And actually, if you look at 2015, their single lap pace relative to the front, the gap stays roughly the same. So they do develop okay through that season. And one of the reasons they started to fall behind later on is there were promises about what investment there would be if they achieved certain targets. And then as Williams' financial state got worse, those promises weren't delivered on, which is one of the things that led to Pat Symonds moving on, because they just couldn't afford to do those investments. But it was interesting. I was looking back through some of the interview sessions for that. It was either in Australia or Malaysia. Someone asked Rob Smedley in one of his sessions, "Oh, can you keep pace with development?" And his response was, "Oh, that's one of the first questions Ed Straw asked me last year. Look what we did." So evidently, I was considered to be the negative one in 2014, because I do remember doubting their ability to that year, but they did deliver on it. And as Ben said, actually, I think in 15 they did show that they could kind of keep pace, certainly with relation to the gap to Mercedes, although, as Ben explained, other teams were getting their act together as well.
We've already talked about Honda then in great detail. Let's move on to the other F1 manufacturer having an awful time in the early days of the hybrid era, Renault. In an amusing contrast with Honda, Renault boss Cyril Abiteboul told Autosport early in the year that Renault was not going to have a strong enough engine to win a race on merit with Red Bull in 2015. And with things going so badly, Abiteboul revealed that Renault was reviewing its F1 future, with one of the options under consideration being to walk away entirely. Abiteboul said, if Formula One is bad for Renault's reputation, if we struggle with the current formula, if it is not delivering the value that it costs Renault, then this is what we're looking at. He said for the short term, Renault's priority was to get the engine under control. Then it would review the situation from a marketing perspective to see if there's anything we can do better to do more or less of Formula One. Ed, were things going so badly for Renault at this stage that it seemed realistic that they could walk away from F1 entirely?
Yeah, I think it was possible, because they'd basically been really annoyed that they got no credit, or what they felt was no credit, for winning the championship so many times with Red Bull in the glory years of 2010 to 2013. And then basically they'd been constantly booted by Red Bull since the start of 2014 for letting Red Bull down. So it's felt that the Renault engine programme was only talked about as a negative when it was going badly. Plus, of course, they were struggling, and the steps they promised with the engine to make over the winter, they were not materialised, and there were all sorts of drivability problems, etc. So I think Renault was looking at it and thinking, oh, is this really working for us? Can we really turn this round? Is this helping us to have this programme? Exactly, yeah. Is it really worth us doing? So there was some soul search. I do think there was a possibility that Renault could have taken that avenue. They certainly looked at a multitude of options.
And also we know from the discussions Red Bull and Adrian Newey, etc., had been having with Renault the previous year, that they were only in it for the marketing. Carlos Ghosn didn't want to spend the money. He wanted to do it on the cheapest budget he could possibly do it. So you just had this constant tension of Renault underestimating the formula, not spending enough money on the engine, really annoying Red Bull. Red Bull then slagging them off massively in the media. So all the marketing they were getting was just negative and terrible. So I think Abiteboul was in quite a difficult position of trying to kind of keep the thing afloat, but not really getting support from any side.
I think that's why they liked the V8 era so much, wasn't it? For most of that, engines were frozen, and you made your performance gains by pretending you had a reliability thing you needed to fix. But there was, by this point, we kind of had all-out engine war on new technology that they were miles behind on. So Alongside speculation that Renault could leave F1, this is so Renault, there was also talk that it could take over a team, with Red Bull's second team, Toro Rosso, believed to be the target. Habitable said part of Renault's evaluation of its F1 programme was to see how it could improve the situation we have, and that was on two fronts. The first, as we've mentioned quite a lot there already, was marketing. Habitable said, these are public quotes, he said, "We are here for marketing. We are here to deliver a story." And as Ed mentioned, he said that even when Renault was enjoying success as Red Bull's works engine partner during those V8 years and all the success with Sebastian Vettel, Habitable said from a marketing perspective, it was not delivering a great story because Renault didn't get enough recognition for Red Bull's success. He also pointed out that coming into F1 solely as an engine supplier, Renault had no financial incentive to develop and fund engine development because F1 paid its prize money to the teams. Hence, Renault wondering if actually the way to get more recognition and to be financially incentivized to be in F1 was to own a team again. As for Toro Rosso, its longtime boss, Franz Tost, welcomed the talk of Renault buying in. Tost said it would be a fantastic opportunity and would allow the team that was once Minardi to make the next step forward. He added, to be owned by a manufacturer would be exactly the step the team needs, and he went on to then state his constant ambition of Toro Rosso becoming a top 5 team in F1, which was a running joke for all of us when we were covering pre-season testing in this era. Ben, we know Renault did end up buying a team later this year, but it was the Enstone-based Lotus that it owned before, not Toro Rosso. Could Renault buying Toro Rosso have actually worked?
Yeah, they went for Enstone because it was a cheaper deal, right? So just go that way. I honestly don't think so because Red Bull and Renault don't trust each other. So I don't really see how the deal gets over the line. Red Bull wanted control over driver lineups and having the political benefits of the second team too. They have to give that up if they sell the team to Renault. So I don't really see how it would have happened without Renault kind of just accepting being some kind of major shareholder with, labelling rights, livery rights, which was talked about, Toro Rosso becoming this kind of yellow team, or Red Bull quitting F1 so they don't care and it's kind of a fire sale, which obviously that was on the agenda too. Red Bull were getting so frustrated with their lack of performance, they were making quit threats. So I think it at this point, it's kind of one or the other. I don't see how they coexist, if you like, and do a deal together. So no, I don't think it would have worked.
Let's talk about those Red Bull quit threats then, because there were comments made by Helmut Marko in Australia where he'd suggested there was a danger that Red Bull owner Dietrich Mateschitz would lose his passion for F1 as Red Bull continued to complain about the hybrid engines and Mercedes' dominance, the latter of which we'll come back to in a moment. Red Bull team boss Christian Horner tried to clarify Marko's comments ahead of Malaysia, saying that what Marko meant was if Renault quits F1, Mercedes and Ferrari wouldn't supply Red Bull and then they'd be forced to leave. All right. He then added, as with any company, Red Bull reviews its return on investment. Is Formula One delivering for Red Bull as a brand? There are some worrying signs when we see races like we saw in Melbourne, but hopefully that's one chapter in a longer story. Red Bull wants to compete and wants to be in F1. Ed, do you think there was ever a real chance that Red Bull could have quit F1 during these early hybrid struggles?
It was probably unlikely they would, but they were definitely trying to make something happen because there was basically constant attempts to find a different engine supplier that kept flaring up in this period. And obviously they were eventually destined, which wasn't even something that was considered possible, even in the distant future down the line, hooking up with McLaren reject Honda. And I think this quit threat, it was Marko sort of set it off. When you really want to get worried about the Red Bull quit threats was when Dietrich Mateschitz started saying it. That was kind of when the big guns are really out. And sort of I think Christian Horner tried to slightly roll back on it, but they're also trying to apply some leverage to get some help to, see if F1 or Bernie Ecclestone or whoever will lean on one of the other manufacturers to help them. So it's all part of that game because they were a bit fed up with Renault and they were stuck with Renault for quite some time yet, of course. But I think at this point they weren't too serious about that. But I think it's one of those things where they were thinking, well, what's the point if we can't get into a competitive enough position to win championships again?
It was also a time where Marco was causing trouble by, I think, having lots of meetings with his mate Niki Lauda, and they were feeling like they could get a Merc deal over the line, and that it was all about that. It was like, if we can get a good engine, then all of this noise will go away. But if we have to stay stuck with this terrible Renault engine, then we want to make a big fuss to try and get something to, as Ed said, move. And eventually the rules did change, because now there's a needlessly complicated formula to decide who gets an engine if no one will supply you. But Red Bull drove that, because when they came to the point where they definitely wanted to get rid of Renault, nobody would supply them an engine. So in the end, Renault got a really good deal out of all of this mess, because they got Red Bull to overpay for engines that they were going to give them anyway.
Yeah, the tag. I thought Red Bull were powered by Tag Heuer in those years that followed. Horner also backed off his own comments, so he wasn't just tidying up Marco's mess. He had to tidy up some of his own from Australia as well, where he suggested something should be done to close up the field due to Mercedes' dominance. Horner felt that when Red Bull and other teams had been dominating, they regularly had to deal with rule tweaks to keep them on their toes. And he'd wondered if F1 needed an equalisation mechanism, that sounds a bit Ron Dennis, doesn't it, to reel Mercedes back towards the rest of the pack. He then clarified his comments ahead of Malaysia to Autosport, saying he knew it was unlikely to happen and that it probably wouldn't be right for the FIA to take such measures. He admitted he'd been speaking out of frustration in Australia, but he still called the situation unhealthy to have such big gaps between the engine manufacturers. And when he got to Malaysia, Horner said, unless there is an intervention like that, then we are set for a season with quite a broad running order. These comments caught Lewis Hamilton's attention, with the world champion calling them funny and saying it was an interesting opinion coming from an individual who has had so much success. Horner said he understood why people might think it was a bit rich coming from a team that had been successful just before the hybrid engines came in, but he added, we never had the level of dominance that we are seeing now. Ben, given Red Bull had won 4 championships in a row from 2010 to 2013, did Horner's complaints fall on deaf ears with most people in the F1 paddock?
Yes, pretty much. You know, he was kind of the worst poster child for this subject, and there were legitimate concerns. I think everybody apart from Mercedes underestimated the challenge of developing the hybrid engines. There was actually a kind of equalisation mechanism in the rules, in the sense that development was limited by tokens. So they didn't want to have kind of rampant. The whole point of that system was to prevent rampant development and one manufacturer running away with things, but I don't think anyone anticipated how far ahead Mercedes would start. And then they were trying to unpick this and go, well, all the other manufacturers in a straitjacket, and Renault were saying, well, we can't develop quickly enough because of this token system. Honda, obviously, even in an even worse position. And they wanted to unpick this, but they also didn't want to do it because they thought it would help Mercedes. And nobody really kind of knew the way forward. I think Horner was particularly frustrated because Renault had promised, obviously, a lot of development over the winter. And I remember watching that Renault engine trackside in pre-season testing, and it was awful. Like, the drivability was noticeably wheel spinny compared to the other engines. And I think he was just kind of railing against, this is even worse than last year, where they won a handful of races. But of course, you know, if you're the guy running a team that's won 4 championships in a row and everyone's gone, they've made F1 really boring. And yeah, okay, there were some rule tweaks that kind of pegged them back, but it didn't stop them winning. You can't then be the guy to stand up and say, those guys are winning now, we need to peg them back for the good of Formula One. I mean, it just rings hollow, doesn't it?
At the other end of the grid, we finally saw the Manor cars in action after they'd failed to run at all in Australia due to software glitches. Both Will Stevens and Roberto Merhi successfully ran on Friday in Malaysia, although Stevens' car then developed a fuel system problem which prevented him from running in qualifying. He was permitted to take part in the race because his pace in practice was deemed to be quick enough to indicate that he could have qualified within 107%, but the problem couldn't be fixed for the race. Merhi didn't quite get inside 107%, but he was allowed to race due to the speed Stevens had showed in practice, and Roberto did at least make it to the end, 3 laps down. The problematic start to the season led to suggestions that Manor perhaps wasn't capable of running two cars properly, which its sporting director, Graham Loudon, now in charge of Cadillac's new F1 team, called complete utter nonsense. Ed, you love a backmarker. What sort of state were Manor in at this point in 2015?
Well, they're in the process, really, of getting back up and running and having been in administration. So it was hastily thrown together that season. They hadn't been able to test. They're having to kind of rebuild all their software stuff and that kind of thing. So it was kind of a point where the whole season was about survival, really. It was a carryover car as well with a few little bits and pieces. And yeah, they could theoretically have run both cars. There was no specific reason that they couldn't, other than the fact that things kept not working. So they were really in that point where you'd want to be kind of before testing even starts when the racing happened. And then they kind of got settled and going okay, but with a car that was nowhere near the pace. So this was all about getting the team back up and running again and kind of getting it into the next season, if you like, where they actually sort of did okay. But it's really important for them to do so because they got their share of the prize money by having two positions in the top 10 in the previous 3 years going into this year. So there was a real motivation to get the team up and running, benefit from that, and then rebuild from there. So yeah, 15 was about survival, and it was just all hands on deck, just trying to scramble through the early races, having hastily thrown everything together, because that team wasn't buried, but it was basically dead and in administration at one stage over the winter.
Let's go on to the real action then. And in a rain-hit qualifying session, the big story was that Ferrari's Sebastian Vettel had managed to split the dominant Mercedes, lining up on the front row alongside pole sitter Lewis Hamilton. The Red Bulls of Daniel Ricciardo and Daniel Kvyat completed the top 5 behind Nico Rosberg in the second Mercedes, with Toro Rosso rookie Max Verstappen excelling in the tricky conditions to take 6th ahead of the Williamses of Felipe Massa and Valtteri Bottas. Verstappen said he'd smiled when the rain hit during qualifying, saying that's what I like, and that being Dutch, I'm used to driving in the wet. He also felt that he was doing a good job of proving to people that coming into F1 aged 17 wasn't proving to be a problem, saying, I always said it was up to me to show the people that I am not too young. Ben, we'll come back to Max's race later on, but was this performance in qualifying an early glimpse of how good he was going to be in the rain as an F1 driver?
Yeah, I think it probably was, although it doesn't stand out to me. It didn't stand out to me at the time.
That's because you don't remember it.
Well, it could be. But I think also because there were some other things that kind of almost overshadowed him. I mean, for one thing, Toro Rosso that year was quite a good car. But also his teammate Carlos Sainz, another driver quite good in the wet, was quite close to him. So it wasn't one of those obvious situations where like one teammate is dazzling and the other one's struggling, and you go, "Oh wow, why is there such a massive offset?" Plus, I remember Q3, like Lewis Hamilton's first lap, he was ridiculously faster than everyone else. It was like one of the Lewis Hamilton specials. So you had a kind of slightly more dominant immediate qualifying story, and there was, as you mentioned in the question, a lot of noise about Verstappen proving the doubters wrong, and is he too young to race in F1? This is something Franz Tost picked up on later in the weekend too. But I think from our perspective inside, we'd already bought into this idea that Verstappen was more than good enough. We'd seen glimpses of his talent from the cameos he'd done in free practices in 2014 in the Toro Rosso Japan. He did Brazil as well, I think. And we all knew at this point, working at Autosport especially, the famous Norris Ring F3 story where he was miles quicker than all his rivals, and that convinced Helmut Marko to pull out all the stops to get Verstappen into Formula 1 as quickly as he could. So this idea that Verstappen was a rainmaster was kind of in the minds of some of us in the paddock already established. So if anything, it wasn't really a surprise. It was what you expected him to do.
At the start of the race, the leaders held position, with Vettel fending off a bit of an attack from Rosberg, but the race was turned on its head on just lap 4 when Marcus Ericsson spun off at the first corner and a safety car was brought out. Most cars came into the pits for fresh tyres, but 5 drivers stayed out. The 2 Force Indias of Nico Hülkenberg and Sergio Perez, Carlos Sainz's Toro Rosso, Romain Grosjean's Lotus, and most importantly, Vettel's Ferrari, which assumed the lead. Early leader Hamilton was therefore behind them in 6th, with Rosberg losing out to Ricciardo and Massa due to having to double stack in the pit lane and then waiting for a gap to be released into. Vettel said afterwards he was surprised to see both Mercedes pit so early and give up track position, but Rosberg said it was always Mercedes' plan that if there was an early safety car, both cars would come in, and they hadn't expected so many cars to stay out. Ed, removing the benefit of hindsight for a moment, at the time, were you surprised that Mercedes sacrificed the track position of both cars with these early stops?
Yeah, you can make a case that it was a bit of a surprise, but at the same time, I think it almost felt more of a surprise that Ferrari stayed out. If you're just looking at kind of normal races, but it all ties into the way they were looking after the tyres that weekend or not. Mercedes, obviously the key to this weekend is Mercedes were struggling much more on the tyres. So I think it was logical for them to take what they could in terms of a cheap stop, and even though it was really early, get off that set of tyres. But yeah, obviously they kind of thought, I think everybody would have done that. So that was probably the surprise element, that it wasn't the absolute standard thing for everybody to do. But yeah, I don't think it wasn't wrong to have done it at that stage, because they were in a bit of tyre strife. But it did unfortunately mean they had to spend a longer proportion of the race using the hards than the mediums, which wasn't ideal. So ideally their safety car, if it had come, would have come a little bit longer into that stint, where they could have benefited a little bit longer from the mediums, but not too long, because as we saw later on, they'd then drop off quite quickly.
I do think it was an example of Mercedes maybe being a little bit flat-footed. I think they were quite used to just racing by themselves and quite preoccupied with not favouring one driver over the other in what they expected to be a kind of...
They were never going to split strategies here, were they?
Exactly. And if you're racing another car, that's exactly what you would do. You'd have left one out. If you weren't sure, leave one out, pit one. But they were so focused on making sure it was equal between Rosberg and Hamilton. They just did what they planned to do and stuck to it rigidly. And that allowed Ferrari to kind of steal in. And then, as Ed said, the tyre management difference made the difference in the end. But I remember, this question of what should they have done with that first safety car period really was at the crux of how Mercedes should have played that race, and asking Toto Wolff about it afterwards. And he was quite preoccupied with this idea that, they needed to wake up a bit and maybe reconsider the way they were going racing. I mean, as it turned out, it didn't matter too much in the overall pattern of the season. But at this point, you thought, oh, actually, yeah, they've been slapped around a bit here, because they've just been focused on themselves and haven't thought more flexibly about how the race might play out.
It's a slightly strange scenario in that it made it easier for Vettel to go on and do what he did, because of the way it all panned out, but it's not necessarily wrong. It's a really sort of strange... I think there's always focus on strategy, isn't there? But sometimes it's the pace that defines things. And I think kind of the actual way they executed the strategy is almost secondary, but it did give them less chance to interfere with Vettel's race, let's put it that way.
Mercedes' early stops then committed both of its drivers to 3-stop races, while Vettel out front was planning to make just 2. So after the safety car, the 3 cars we're focusing on here had the same number of stops remaining, and Vettel was now the one out front. Hamilton and Rosberg made their way back up to second and third by the time Vettel made his first stop on lap 17. But they'd not been making up ground on him before his stop, and when he came out in third, he quickly caught and passed Rosberg again. In fact, in the F1 season review from 2015, they played some, what I thought was amusing radio between Rosberg and his engineer when Vettel was catching him at this point. So let's quickly hear that.
Talk to me about the race against Vettel.
Both of you have one more stop to make, Nico. Both of you have one more stop to make. He's on newer tyres. He will push to try and close the gap to you.
Say it to me simpler. So if he goes by me, then he's won. I mean, has he beat me then?
A firm.
Vettel retook the lead just as Hamilton dived for the pits for the second time. And while the Mercedes drivers pulled back a little bit of time in the middle portion of the race, by this point Vettel had plenty of margin to play with. After the final stops were complete, he was almost 15 seconds clear of Hamilton, and he just sort of managed that all the way to the flag to take a comfortable victory in just his second start for Ferrari. Vettel said that in the closing laps, he'd had to tell himself to stop thinking about the fact he was about to win a race in the red of Ferrari in case he lost concentration, and he said crossing the finish line was a relief. He said it was maybe a little bit better than his first win at Monza in 2008 or his first win for Red Bull in 2009, because winning for Ferrari was a dream, especially as he'd grown up idolising Michael Schumacher. He also called it an incredible achievement to be the first driver to beat Mercedes fair and square in the hybrid era, as their handful of defeats in 2014 had always involved some sort of massive misfortune for Hamilton and Rosberg. Ben, how significant was that element? Not only Vettel winning so quickly for Ferrari, but also the fact that for the first time, really, Mercedes was straight up beaten on the day.
Yeah, it felt massively exciting and significant at the time. You had, on the one hand, this incredible story of Vettel winning for Ferrari. There was this feeling that James Allison was really transforming the team technically, and it was a bit of a kind of Allison Lotus style special, wasn't it? You know, doing the race on fewer stops. It's how Kimi Räikkönen managed to steal a few races in the previous V8 era. But at the same time, you know, okay, you had Vettel, you know, getting a bit of a bounce from it too. That was nice. He'd had a terrible 2014 season and, you know, been quite disenfranchised with F1. So it was a really feel-good story to see him at Ferrari and it you know, reaping some rewards so early. And we all wanted to see Mercedes challenge because they were having it so much their own way at this point. You know, at the time having to report on F1 and particularly write race reports, finding a different way to talk about pretty much the same race between Hamilton and Rosberg on a different circuit was getting quite tiresome. So this was like a shot in the arm. But although we wanted it to be kind of the sign of a game-on championship fight between like two big teams and two great champions in Vettel and Hamilton, actually it just turned out to be one of those kind of hot circuit Mercedes anomalies that kind of still bug them to this day, really, don't they?
I think it's quite funny looking back as well, because it also felt like the Maurizio Arriva-Bene era at Ferrari was going to be brilliant, didn't it? It actually, if you look at the coverage then, it did seem like that. But actually, with the benefit of knowing a bit more about exactly what was going on and how all the timelines worked, a lot of this recovery in 15 was actually down to what the old regime had done, under Domenicali, in fact, who started the season in charge, didn't he? Because I think they felt that because Luca de Montezemolo had also gone, had always pushed so hard for, we want upgrades right now. You can't work towards the future. That had delayed them starting on 14, including on the power unit side. And so they were dreadful at the start of 14. And that incumbent regime, the Domenicali-led one, felt they then put some things in place that led to what happened in 15. But then, of course, because Arriva-Bene's there, he looks like the hero because he's turned up and they've won almost immediately.
So you're not giving the credit to Marco Mattiacci?
No, not Marco Mattiacci and his famous first appearance in China with the sunglasses when it was very gloomy. I remember one of Ferrari's press people saying, why is everyone mocking him? And I just said, well, if you wear sunglasses in the dark, you look like an idiot, don't you? You look like you're a poser. And he'd actually done it because he'd flown overnight and he didn't want to look knackered. But anyway, I've digressed massively there. But so there's a few things happening. Obviously, James Allison had arrived in, I think, about September, October 13. So it certainly did reflect Allison's contribution. But it's funny what seemed to be happening here, this amazing start to the certain to succeed Vettel era at Ferrari, the new leadership, etc., it wasn't quite as it seemed. And obviously, although Ferrari was quicker on race pace, the Mercedes was still the faster car. It's just down to the fact that Ferrari could make the mediums work, and so they could do medium, hard. And that also helped them because it meant they were on the slower hard when the hard was at its best, when the track was gripped up at the end, whereas Mercedes had to kind of do more running on that hard tyre. So although Ferrari won fair and square, they didn't win because they had the faster car. They won because they had the better car in those conditions. And I think I'd argue with the 3 wins Ferrari got that year, that was probably the only one on race day. They were just the stronger, better car, because the other couple they got, there were some circumstances at play as well. So, yeah, it seemed like a brilliant thing for Ferrari. It seemed like it was great for Formula One, but actually, yeah, this wasn't quite as positive as it maybe seemed at the time.
Yeah, bit of a false dawn. But Hamilton said Mercedes were not expecting Ferrari to be as strong as they were. Let's also quickly give a shout out to Kimi Räikkönen, who came back from an early puncture to finish 4th in the second Ferrari. Hamilton felt that Ferrari were better than Mercedes on tyre degradation, so he wasn't sure if he'd have been able to beat Vettel, even if he had stayed out during that first safety car. However, Lewis said that first stop gave him too much ground to make up, so fighting from the win from that point was pretty much impossible. Mercedes boss Toto Wolff felt his team went too aggressive with its setup, which forced it into that 3-stop strategy. And while he felt that Mercedes dropping itself into traffic hurt its ability to look after its tyres, he accepted that we were not the fastest car today over long runs. Wolff also said, "We had a new situation that we haven't had for a while, that we were not in control of things. It didn't pan out the way we expected." And future Mercedes technical boss James Allison, who, as we've mentioned, at this point is masterminding things technically at Ferrari, felt that if Mercedes had kept Hamilton out in front of Vettel, the difference between them probably wouldn't have been big enough for Vettel to find a way through. I found that quite interesting little comment, which I think might have been an auto course. Ed, was Ferrari's tyre management good enough here that Vettel would have beaten the Mercedes regardless? Or do you think Allison's right that actually if the Mercs had stayed in the way, or if Hamilton had stayed in the way, Vettel's advantage wouldn't have been enough to make the difference?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where if you look at pure pace over the race and the way it would have ebbed and flowed, although there were a few times when Hamilton was quick, like when he put on for his third stint, he put on the one set of fresh mediums he had for the race, and at the start of that stint he was really quick, but then obviously it started to drop away. So I think if you look at the sum total of the race, the Ferrari would have been in a stronger position, but there were various different routes. The route that did happen was the easier route to victory for Vettel because the Mercedes drivers both pitted and got out of the way. However, they would have been vulnerable in the second half of stints as well to Vettel, so we could have seen a catch and a pass on track. But it's like that thing I said earlier. Mercedes, by making that safety car stop, denied themselves the opportunity to interfere more directly in Vettel's race, and that changed things. And the real gap at the end was about 10 seconds, I think, when you, I think as Ben mentioned in his race report, if you ignore the fact Vettel did a bit of celebrating at the end of the last lap, it was about 10 and a bit seconds was the real gap. So if you say the safety car pit stop didn't happen and Hamilton didn't lose just over 4 seconds going through those other drivers that stayed out, the Hulkenbergs and people like that who didn't pit, then it comes down to 6, and then you think, well, how many seconds could have been saved in other areas? Could they have held Vettel? I do agree with Allison that it would have been a little bit more complicated and it might not have happened, but I think, race pace is always very, very valuable. And if you got into a position where it was Hamilton late in a stint threatening Vettel, then or Vettel rather late in a stint on better conditioned tyres threatening Hamilton, then a pass could well have happened. But it was made easier. But I'm hesitant to say Mercedes got it completely wrong, beyond saying perhaps it was logical to have split the strategy so that they could have had things to play out differently, because obviously it wasn't great for Rosberg being the second in the double stack when they made that safety car pit stop, and he ended up in an even worse position than Hamilton did after that stop.
Behind the Ferraris and the Mercedes at the top of the order, Bottas and Massa took a 5-6 for Williams, with the Toro Rossos of Verstappen and Sainz 7th and 8th, ahead of the Red Bulls of Kvyat and Ricciardo. Lots of formation flying here. The Red Bulls were struggling with managing temperatures, particularly in traffic, and their brakes in particular were getting out of control, according to Christian Horner. Ricciardo said Red Bull had no weapons in battle, making it impossible to fight anyone for position. He was passed on track, I think, wasn't he, by at least by Verstappen. Horner said the brake problems were likely down to a change of supplier over the winter, and he said it was up to Red Bull to understand how we got ourselves into this position and to engineer ourselves out of it. As for Verstappen, not only was he the final car to finish on the lead lap, but he also became F1's youngest point scorer in just his second start. Although it was, I thought it was really interesting to see him get roughed up a bit on the opening lap. It's not something you'd expect to see today, but he probably gets bashed around by some of the more experienced drivers. Ben, it's the Toro Rosso versus Red Bull thing I want to focus on here. Losing out to the junior team and the all-rookie lineup, did that show that Red Bull's problems here ran much deeper than just blaming the Renault engine that they were making so much noise about? Because Toro Rosso had that as well.
Yeah, I think it sort of does seem like that, and it's certainly true that they did have bigger problems, because this is one of those phases where Newey is particularly disenfranchised with F1. He's already upset in 2014. They've just, he's pretty much 6 months or 9 months into the kind of new glorified consultant role that
he's
they'd
really
given
stepped
him
back
to,
at this point, hasn't
yeah,
he?
massively. They've pulled out all the stops to just keep him tangentially involved, but he's in the very much phase of I'm not going to be involved unless I absolutely have to. So there's a bit of kind of Red Bull having to fly blind without him. But the brake thing itself, like this race, it just felt like there was a very specific thing that they probably could have troubleshooted had they had a more sensible winter testing program, which was undone by the fact that the Renault engine, which was meant to be the newfangled winning super powerful Renault engine, was rubbish. So I think they were kind of distracted by that legitimately, and also the fact they didn't have Newey and they were trying to kind of do things without him. And this is the phase they would then get him in to kind of troubleshoot the car and sort it out when they got to kind of Spain and the first proper upgradey European race of the season. So yeah, the problems were there, but I'm not sure it was Toro Rosso necessarily exposing them. I think they were known, and I think this is just a case of that Toro Rosso being a particularly good car. It's one of the better James Key cars of that period, and the drivers just being star drivers. They were rookies, but they'd had a really solid testing program where they'd focused on how Sainz and Verstappen should use the tyres and manage them, etc. As Ed mentioned before, this was an extreme tyre management race, as they often are in Malaysia. So I think that really played to the way Toro Rosso had managed their own pre-season and specifically developed the skills of Verstappen and Sainz.
Yeah, and if memory serves, they did make a brake change, didn't they, after this? I think they changed to Hitco for this year, which Vettel didn't like, and then they went back to Brembo, perhaps for the next race, which I think was China. My memory of Malaysia 2015 is sketchy, but I think China was the next race. So they did then make a change back to correct that.
Ben's Toro Rosso point is really good as well, actually. The fact that this is a tyre management race and you've got your two rookie drivers both bring it home with really solid points finishes. We have months or even a whole season now of hearing how difficult it is for rookies to get on top of tyre management. So yeah, massive credit to Toro Rosso for focusing on that and for beating the big team. I think it was always funny, particularly if Red Bull were throwing their toys out of the pram. It's always funny when, while they're doing that, the junior team are beating them as well with their exciting driver lineup. Outside of the points, Force India were coming away from Malaysia very upset as both of their drivers were given 10-second penalties for collisions with other cars. Nico Hülkenberg hit Kvyat at turn 2 when battling both Red Bulls towards the back end of the points, while Sergio Perez tangled with Romain Grosjean as the Lotus tried to pass him around the outside of the super fast turn 12 left-hander. Perez said he was trying to avoid Grosjean but couldn't do anything more, and he felt their clash was a racing incident. Hülkenberg said Kvyat turned across him and maybe should have left him some room, and Hulk said that he did try to back out once he realised what was happening, but it was too late. And even Kvyat said afterwards that he thought it was a racing incident. Force India deputy team boss Bob Fernley wasn't happy, saying that his understanding was drivers wouldn't be punished unless it was a blatant or dangerous manoeuvre. And he warned that F1 should try to let drivers race without giving too many penalties. Ed, how did you assess these two collisions? Did they both warrant 10 seconds?
Yeah, well, it depends on exactly where you're setting the bar, aren't you? And this was F1's in an eternal state of flux, isn't it? I mean, I think the Perez Grosjean one, you can say on that because Grosjean was on newer tyres, Perez was on much older ones. Perez should have been wise to the fact that he was going to kind of wash out and catch Grosjean, because it wasn't one of those ones where kind of Grosjean just appears around the outside when Perez has already committed. So I could have lived with that as a racing accident, just with kind of the live by the sword, die by the sword element of going around the outside there. But equally, I look at it and think, well, okay, if you want to give a penalty for that for Perez, okay, probably could have been wise to that. So I'm gently okay with that, but I would be gently okay with him not getting a penalty as well. Probably the Hülkenberg one is a slightly more, it's tricky, that one, because you've got the right-hander turn 1 and then into the left-hander. So if you're that car that's on the outside and has partly been passed, you're kind of still there. But I think probably Hülkenberg needs to be just a little bit further forward when he initially committed to it by the fact he backed out. But again, the fact Fiat was happy to say, well, yeah, racing incident. It's just one of those things where if you're doing the passing, you need to be wary of it, if you like. So Yeah, it's again, both of those ones, I'm sort of gently okay with it, but I'd also been quite happy the other way. And I think that probably tells you where, with these sorts of things, that question of how much is the risk element of the driver doing the passing and where you're putting your car, etc., plays into it, becomes difficult. And I certainly think the Grosjean one, I see why he went there. He did nothing particularly wrong, but there's an element of risk that you might just get tagged by the car, and then it's a question of, well, did Perez need to sort of concede a little more because he was going to get past whatever happens.
Let's finish roughly where we started then and head back to McLaren. We're not going to talk about them for another half an hour or whatever we did at the start, but we will acknowledge their race. Alonso and Button both retired with, shock of shocks, power unit problems. It was cooling for Alonso and a turbo issue for Button. But McLaren was brimming with optimism after the race. Of course they were. Alonso called the whole weekend better than I expected, and he said the main positive from the race was that he and Button were able to run with other cars. That's how bad it was. Like, this was an achievement, rather than just fighting each other at the back. He was surprised by the car's pace in race trim and was pleased to be catching the troubled Red Bulls, and was running 8th before he was forced to retire. Button also called fighting in the pack the most positive thing about McLaren's weekend, and he too was surprised to have seen a Red Bull up ahead at one stage. He called the weekend useful, even if it was a shame not to make the finish, and he said the progress McLaren had made since the first race in Australia was exceptional. Speaking about the unreliability, Alonso said, "These are the sort of problems you'd normally discover in pre-season testing, but given our lack of running over the winter, unfortunately, we're likely to encounter such issues in the first few races." McLaren racing director Eric Boullier accepted that there was still a lot of ground to be made up, but he said the difference compared to testing and Australia was massive. Ben, were McLaren justified in hailing all of this progress over this weekend, where they were still quite near the back and still neither car got anywhere near the finish?
Yeah, they sort of are and aren't justified, because this
sounds like Ed answering the racing incident question from just before.
It does sound very Ed. I'm gently okay with it, and I'm also gently not okay with it. That they basically are living in, like, there's two parallel McLaren universes at this point. There's the kind of very specific, localized, yes, race to race, we need to go from this to this to this, and they have made a step forward, because their first steps in testing in the first race are so woefully bad they almost can't be any worse. And yeah, so they're a slightly better Q1 loser in Malaysia than they were in Australia. Yeah, they were kind of on the back of other cars and making a race of it in a hot tyre management race where they've got two wily experienced champion drivers to do the tyre management. But they're still having the failures. I mean, they're happy to do more consecutive laps than they were able to do in testing with the Honda engine. Also, the Honda engine was detuned. So there was this element of, well, that should mean it goes further into the race and maybe makes the tyre management, certainly the rears, a bit better. And then in the other McLaren universe, there's the kind of high expectation, lofty Ron Dennis pressure. You know, we need to be winning. And they're kind of realistic. You've got Eric Boullier saying, look, we're not measuring the absolute progress at the moment, because that's fighting for victories and championships. So they kind of are aware that it's really bad, but at the same time, they're kind of clinging to the day-by-day positives of, okay, we're trending from a really awful low point in the right direction. But I mean, you know, ultimately, let's face it, it's embarrassment. It was an embarrassing start. This is a continuation of the embarrassment, really. There's no way McLaren and Honda should be so woefully uncompetitive. And of course, this is the Alonso deck chair meme season, isn't it? They get to Brazil at the end of it and it's still really bad, and he's just there sitting in the chair after another engine failure. Probably the turbo, that was one of the weakest bits. You know, having had however many engine components and grid penalties and whatnot. And I think even at that same race, Button and Alonso do a joke podium as well, because it's been such a bad season. They pretend to have finished 1-2 in the Brazilian Grand Prix in front of some cameras, and there's some good footage of it. So it was comedically bad. It was so comedically bad that the drivers were taking the piss out of the team towards the end of the season. So yeah, I think it's just putting a brave face on what is terrible. What they do at this point think won't be terrible forever, but ultimately was terrible forever.
It's actually quite funny to think of the trajectory, isn't it? Because at this point, although it started awfully, everyone's expecting McLaren Honda to get there. I don't think anyone would say they won't get there. And actually, with the stuttering progress that's made through 15, and actually quite a respectable 16, it's often forgotten, they did look like they were on the right track. And it was all about, right, well, if the engine changes for next year work and we start well, yeah, this is really motory. And then you get to testing and you're like, oh no, this is doomed. Because I don't think it's for really almost another 2 years that you realise McLaren Honda really is doomed. So it's important to remember at this point, this is, while it's pretty terrible, it just feels like teething problems for a program that's not mature enough, rather than something far, far, far more significant for both team and engine supplier, which is what it later proved to be.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Even us, as I said, I remember Ben kind of being assigned as sort of Captain Honda during this era. And yes, it was very clear how bad it was, and McLaren maybe were trying to sort of paint a brighter picture than was true at times, and we kind of didn't let them off the hook for that. But all of our criticism was never in a belief at this stage that it was never going to come good. It was just, it's so bad at the moment.
Yeah, you're right. And they got a lot of grace as well because of how other manufacturers struggled so much. You know, mature ones that had been in Formula One consistently and had the year or two or more head start on this particular
Honda came in late, didn't they?
Honda came in late, undercooked and, not prepared. So we were giving them a certain amount of leeway because Ferrari, as Ed mentioned, were awful in 2014, that really terrible heavy engine and the massive overhaul that was instigated in that department that led to the rise, or the modern rise of Mattia Binotto, etc. Plus you had Renault, still bad, having pushed for the rules, undercooked them in 14, then course corrected, focused on the internal combustion engine, made a terrible job of that. So it wasn't just Honda in isolation being awful and letting McLaren down, and McLaren Honda collectively being bad. They were, everywhere you looked, there was kind of hybrid mess being made. So that kind of gave McLaren Honda a little bit more of a grace period than maybe they deserved in the end. But certainly at this point, you were like, okay, yeah, this is awful. But I mean, there's so many teams being awful, so many engines being awful. So it's just par for the course.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's such a different time. It was only 10 years ago. But I think we've taken enough shots at McLaren Honda there. Let's, like they did, like Alonso and Button did, let's park our hybrids up. Although we at least made it to the end of the 2015 Malaysian Grand Prix. Now, the last hybrid episode we did was on Canada 2014, and that was one of our most listened to episodes of Season 9. So if that's the case this time as well, I'm sure we'll take our ear defenders back off again sometime in the future and look back on some more mid-2010s action. Thank you, Ben and Ed, for your first-hand memories, those that you can still recall. For this one. Next time, though, we're heading back to a race that will feel pretty familiar to those of you in the Race Members Club, as we're doing a full episode on the 1993 Monaco Grand Prix, which we've recently covered in the shorter format of our members-only revisited series. But even if you've already listened to that one, fear not, this time we'll be giving the whole weekend of Ayrton Senna's final Monaco win the full Bring Back V10s treatment.